Hello, my name is Antonio Elefano, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Southern California. I teach in the writing program. I'm also a lawyer who teaches multiple undergraduate courses at USC on legal writing. In my role as the writing program's legal writing specialist, I often find myself standing at an uncomfortable intersection. Among collegiate writing's most worthy endeavors is ensuring that the college classroom invites and honors multiple voices, especially those who have been historically marginalized. At the same time, I teach students who are hoping to enter an industry where the mode and expectation for discourse is incredibly narrow. So on the one hand, I share my writing program's desire to expand the academic conversation, both what we talk about and how we talk about it. On the other hand, I very much want to honor what my students have signed up for, an introduction to the norms of the American legal industry. Now, negotiating these objectives is tricky, and the means by which I attempt to do it comes not from rhetoric and composition or from my experiences in law school, but from an entirely different school of thought altogether. So before I taught, I was a corporate litigator in New York. And during my 5th year there in my law firm, I applied to graduate schools for creative writing and ultimately left my law firm to get an MFA in fiction writing from Boston University. Now, this was my first substantial introduction to the creative writing workshop, where 10 serious writers and a published author professor spend 3 hours a week critiquing the work of 2 of its 10 members. It is an arduous, difficult, and incredibly beneficial process. So after my MFA, I worked at BU as an adjunct professor teaching introduction to writing and advanced fiction writing. And then after BU, I had the pleasure of doing a 2-year writing and teaching fellowship at the University of Houston, where I really honed in on how to use these creative writing style workshops in composition classes. The process I adopted at U of H and then later in freshman composition at USC was similar to the creative writing workshop. Students read other student work ahead of class, often in smallish groups. They work better with sort of 9 or 10. So sometimes I'd have to cut a class in half. But what they would do in a given class is they'd mark the manuscript with any line edits, and they would write ahead of class a 1-page single-spaced critique for each essay we were workshopping that day. And on the 4Cs website, I've uploaded an example of the instructions I give to students, guiding them on how to craft that peer critique. Then when we go to class, students, then we take the time, ideally about 15 minutes or so, at least, to talk about what we think is working in the essay and what's working a little less well. Now, while we do this, just as in a creative writing workshop, the author of the paper has to stay quiet. They have to resist the urge to correct any misreading or misinterpretation of their prose, because what's most important is that the writer can see how their writing is being received, right, without intervention. And then at the end, they'll have an opportunity to speak. Now, obviously, there are differences between graduate level creative writers and freshman composition students. And that naturally translates to a level of investment in the works themselves, right? Some freshman comp students don't care that much about what the essays they're writing. They're there to fulfill a requirement. Whereas creative writers, especially people who are doing it as a graduate degree, they obviously have put a level of investment in that story, in that novel. But there is a point where that caring can feel like too much and can feel counterproductive to the purposes of workshop. Criticizing a 20-year-old for their derivative prose when they put their heart and soul on a page can lead to actual heartbreak. Now, there's less of a risk of that kind of despondency when dealing with an essay on the pros and cons of community college, for example. Or for that matter, a legal memorandum or an appellate brief. Because as well as these workshops translated to the realm of composition, I found they worked even better in the realm of undergraduate legal writing. Students in such a class have more investment in the work they're turning in, as they've self-selected into this population for a reason. But that investment falls short of the kind of counterproductive defensiveness that will often plague a creative writing workshop. So what do you have in an undergraduate legal writing classroom but a captive audience, eager to learn, receptive to criticism, and willing to put in the effort to be better? Well, what does it mean to be better in this context? The first step in teaching anyone how to do legal writing is to teach them how to read legal texts. It's vitally important that students be able to decipher the meaning of statutes and cases, holdings, and dicta. But while gaining command of the language of court opinions is necessary and learning how to analyze the law, those same texts used as a model for rhetoric can feel hopelessly unattainable. In the realm of creative writing, you can use Nabokov, Morrison, Dickens as models because we've read and analyzed storytelling since we were children. But for most undergraduates, their experiences with legal writing are isolated to a couple of cases in a poli-sci class, if that. So you have to start with the basics. In my textbook, Legal Writing for the Undergraduate, I go through the hierarchy of law, how to read a statute, how to brief a case, how to apply law to facts, how to anticipate how a court will decide a novel issue based on precedent, and how to write a legal memorandum. It's always intimidating writing in a new genre, especially one as foreign to them as the legal memo. But one advantage of teaching undergraduates is knowing that your students have oceans of time ahead of them. That mastery of the genre isn't the goal. They aren't heading off to legal practice anytime soon. Rather, your job is to introduce them to the conventions and to support them as they explore the legal field through its most practical, everyday application. Now, submitting your writing to a cohort of peers is daunting in any setting, in any circumstance. But the workshopping process ends up being, for many students, my students, their favorite part of class. It transforms the expectation of an imperious professor marking errors into a collective endeavor where we can discover together in concert the best solutions to a common problem. Instead of comparing their work to the words of Supreme Court justices, they're comparing their arguments to their peers. And they're often amazed and enlightened by the number of approaches and styles. They're inspired by their more proficient classmates and supportive of those whose efforts are less successful. They take ideas on organization and formatting and ultimately build on the strengths that the workshop has seen in their prose as they move forward. They approach critique not from a standpoint of legal expertise, of course, but from the perspective of an eager reader hungry to see alternative approaches. The language of workshop isn't about a student claiming to know what's good or bad. Instead, they talk about what confused them in a given section or what struck them as unusual or illuminating. And their opinions matter in this setting, not because they're authorities on legal writing, because of course they're not, but because, again, they're all working toward the same goal, communicating intelligently and effectively in an entirely new realm. In my legal writing class, we take on the artifice of the law firm. This is a sort of common practice in legal writing classes. A group of motivated minds working on behalf of the same imaginary clients, but the camaraderie they develop in these settings with their mutual respect for fellow authors, with their appreciation for seeing, again, the many and creative ways their peers approach these difficult questions. That is very much real. And it's an extraordinary thing to see in an undergraduate writing class. Now, I always workshop 2 assignments over the course of the term, 2 legal memoranda, and this is in my Introduction to Legal Writing class. The second is always more difficult than the first, and yet the second memos are almost always invariably stronger because of how the class synthesizes the feedback from their first go-round. And what's really great is that second workshop when we're looking through the prose and students are lauding each other for the way that they've seen the writing improve. It's often difficult to see improvement in oneself. You're just too close to your own work, too close to your own education to be able to see it in the moment. But you can see it in someone else. You can see the leaps and bounds that students take. And they see that. The students see that in their fellow students. Now look, at the beginning of this presentation, I posited the dilemma of inviting various modes of discourse and diverse voices to a mode of writing that is unusually stringent and resistant to change. The point of workshop isn't just to diffuse my authority or to replace the standards of professional legal writing with an undergrad class's collectively drawn rubric. No, as the conductor of any orchestra must do, you must lead. You must explain that legal citations aren't just a matter of academic attribution, but of explaining to your reader and to a judge the power and recency of your cited precedent. You must explain that brief answers at the start of the memo are important because they save a senior partner precious time they don't want to spend reading a 20-page memo to get the conclusions they want right now. But again, knowing that no undergraduate student is going to go from your classroom to submitting briefs to a court, knowing that your students have the advantage of time and further instruction in the analysis of law and the nuances of legal writing, should they continue down that path, you can take them through those first steps toward proficiency. You, bolstered by their workshopping cohort, can identify the specific qualities that make them special as writers and show them how to lean into their strengths in this new genre. And if you do this right, you don't just get one example of excellence. You get a mathematician's crystalline syllogisms, an economist's policy reasoning, a journalist's concise statement of facts, an artist's view of the broader stakes of the case. One of the greatest compliments I ever received from a student was that I didn't teach writing by trying to make the class write how I write. Instead, I spent my time trying to make each writer the best possible version of themselves. Now, my secret, as you've already intuited, is that I don't do it alone. If you teach undergraduate legal writing or any kind of writing, I hope you give workshopping a shot. And not just peer review, but workshopping, which is a lot of work, but gratifying in amazing ways. You will be amazed at how close your class will become. Thank you so much for watching this video and for making me feel like the dullest YouTube star in history. Now, this presentation is part of a panel, a larger panel called the Why Are You Here of Legal Writing and Rhetoric. So please use the QR code or the short URL shown here on the screen to see the rest of our wonderful panelists, Brian Larson, Lindsay Head, and our moderator, Lisa Jane Klotz. Thank you again for spending these 15 minutes or so with me. I wish you the best of luck in your classrooms. Thank you.